I still remember that evening more clearly than any other day in my life because nothing about it felt unusual at first. The sky looked the same, the streets sounded the same, and my mind was filled with the same ordinary thoughts that follow a man after a long day of work. I had planned to stay late at the office that night, but something changed at the last minute when my manager told us we could leave early because the system had gone down and there was nothing left to finish. So I packed my bag, feeling strangely relieved because going home early felt like a small unexpected gift from the universe. And as I drove through the quiet streets, I even thought about surprising my wife Emily with her favorite takeout because she loved when I did small things like that, the kind of gestures that made our marriage feel warm and simple and real. Emily and I had been married for 4 years, and during that time I believed we had built something solid, something safe, something that would last a lifetime. We were not perfect, but we had our routines and our laughter and the quiet comfort that comes from knowing someone completely. At least that is what I believed back then. I believed I knew her smile, her habits, her little expressions when she was tired or when she was hiding something funny from me, and never once did I imagine that there were parts of her life I had never seen, parts that would shatter everything I thought I understood about love and trust. As I drove closer to our house, the sun was already starting to disappear behind the trees, casting long shadows across the road, and there was something peaceful about that moment, something calm and ordinary that made what happened next feel even more unreal, because sometimes life does not warn you before it changes forever. Sometimes it simply waits for the exact moment when your guard is down and then everything breaks all at once. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Emily's car was already there, which was normal because she usually came home earlier than me, and I remember smiling to myself thinking she would be surprised to see me home before dinner time. The house looked quiet, the curtains were half closed and the warm yellow light from the living room lamp glowed softly through the window, making everything look calm and familiar and safe. I grabbed the takeout bag from the passenger seat and walked toward the front door, feeling that simple happiness that comes from imagining someone you love opening the door and smiling at you unexpectedly. But when I reached the door, something felt strange, not wrong exactly, just unusual, like a small detail that did not fit perfectly into the picture of the evening I had imagined. The door was unlocked. That alone was not impossible. Emily sometimes forgot to lock it when she was inside, but there was another sound too, something faint coming from deeper inside the house, a sound that made me pause for a moment before stepping in, because it was not the sound of the television and it was not music either. It was quieter than that, almost like voices, but muffled, as if someone was speaking in another room. For a second I thought maybe Emily was on the phone, but something about the tone of the sound made my chest tighten slightly, because it did not feel like a phone conversation. It sounded closer, more private, more secretive, and even though my mind tried to dismiss the feeling, I could not ignore the strange tension growing in the pit of my stomach. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the living room where the lamp was still glowing softly and everything looked exactly the way we had left it that morning. The couch, the coffee table, the framed photos of our wedding day, all sitting quietly in their places as if nothing had changed, but the voices were clearer now, drifting faintly from the hallway that led to the bedroom. My heart began to beat faster, though I could not yet explain why, because part of me still believed there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe Emily had a friend visiting, maybe someone had stopped by unexpectedly and they were talking in the bedroom for privacy. But another part of my mind, a darker, quieter voice, whispered that something about this moment felt wrong in a way I could not describe. I set the takeout bag down on the kitchen counter without making a sound and stood there for a few seconds, listening carefully, trying to understand what I was hearing. And that was when I realized there were definitely two voices. One was Emily's, soft and familiar, and the other was a man's voice, low and quiet and completely unfamiliar. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest because I knew Emily had not mentioned anyone coming over that evening, and she was not the kind of person who invited people to the house without telling me, especially not a man. And yet the voices were there, clear enough now that I could hear the rhythm of their conversation, even though the words themselves were still too quiet to understand. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach kept growing stronger with every step I took down the hallway toward the bedroom door, the sound of their voices becoming clearer and clearer with each step until I was close enough to hear the faint sound of laughter. And that was the moment when something inside me shifted, because that laughter did not sound like the polite laughter of a casual conversation. It sounded intimate, soft and comfortable, the kind of laughter people share when they feel completely at ease with each other. My hand hovered near the bedroom door, and for a brief moment I considered turning around, walking back to the kitchen, pretending I had never heard anything at all. But the truth is, once curiosity and fear mix together, they create a force that is impossible to ignore, and before I could stop myself, my fingers slowly pushed the door open just enough to see inside. And what I saw in that moment is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. For a moment my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing, because sometimes the truth is so shocking that your brain tries to protect you from it by pretending it is not real. But the longer I stood there in the doorway, the more impossible it became to deny what was happening right in front of me. The room smelled faintly of Emily's perfume. The curtains were half closed, letting a thin line of evening light fall across the bed, and on that bed was my wife, sitting close to a man I had never seen before, their bodies leaning toward each other in a way that was far too familiar, far too comfortable to be innocent. And when the door moved slightly under my hand, Emily turned her head toward me, and the color drained from her face so quickly that for a second she looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. The man sitting beside her froze as well, his shoulders stiffening as he followed her gaze toward the door, and suddenly the room was filled with a silence so heavy that it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. And in that moment none of us spoke, because there are certain moments in life when words are too small to carry the weight of what is happening, and all you can do is stand there feeling the ground beneath your life slowly begin to crack. Emily's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say my name, but no sound came out at first, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at me on our wedding day with love and certainty and trust. And I remember thinking how strange it was that those same eyes now held nothing but fear and guilt, as if the person sitting on that bed was someone I had never truly known. My heart was beating so loudly that it felt like it might burst through my chest, but at the same time there was a strange calm spreading through my mind, the kind of calm that comes when shock numbs every other emotion. And even though 1,000 questions were screaming inside my head, the only thing I could do was stare at the man sitting beside my wife, trying to understand who he was and why he was here in my house, sitting on my bed like he belonged there. He looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger, with dark hair and a tense expression that suggested he was already calculating how to escape this situation without making it worse. But the truth was there was no escape, not anymore, not after what I had already seen. And the longer we stood there staring at each other, the more the reality of the moment settled into the room like a thick cloud that none of us could breathe through. Finally Emily stood up from the bed, her movements slow and uncertain like someone walking across thin ice, and she took a small step toward me, her hands slightly raised as if she believed she could calm the storm that was about to break just by speaking softly. But before she could say anything, the man behind her suddenly stood as well, his eyes darting toward the door and then back toward me as if measuring the distance between us. For a few seconds none of us moved, and then Emily finally spoke my name in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared in the silence of the room. And hearing my name in that moment felt like someone pressing a knife into a wound that had just opened, because the way she said it carried both desperation and regret, and yet somehow it still sounded like a lie. I could feel the anger rising slowly inside me like fire spreading through dry wood, but it was not the explosive kind of anger people imagine when they think about betrayal. It was colder, heavier, more controlled, the kind that settles deep in your chest and burns quietly while your mind tries to understand how everything you believed about your life could collapse in a single moment. The man finally cleared his throat and took a cautious step forward as if he intended to explain something, but the moment he opened his mouth I raised my hand slightly, stopping him without saying a word, because whatever explanation he thought he could give was something I was not ready to hear, not yet, not while the image of them sitting together on that bed was still burning into my memory. Emily looked back at him quickly as if silently begging him not to speak, and then she turned to me again, her eyes shining with tears that had begun to gather at the corners, and for the first time since I walked into the house she managed to form a full sentence, though her voice trembled with every word. She said it was not what it looked like. Hearing that sentence felt almost surreal, because it was the exact phrase people use when they have been caught in a lie too obvious to deny, and yet she said it anyway, as if the words themselves might somehow rewrite reality if she repeated them enough times. And for a moment I almost laughed, not because anything about the situation was funny, but because the absurdity of that excuse was too much for my stunned mind to process. I slowly stepped into the room, closing the distance between us, while the man instinctively moved slightly to the side, creating space between himself and Emily, as if that small gesture could somehow erase what I had already seen. And when I was finally standing a few feet away from them I spoke for the first time since opening the door, my voice sounding strangely calm even to my own ears. I asked a simple question. Who is he? The silence that followed stretched so long that it felt like time itself had stopped waiting for someone to answer, and Emily looked at the man again before looking back at me, as if she was trying to decide which version of the truth would hurt less. But the truth about betrayal is that there is no version that hurts less once the illusion of trust has already been broken. Finally the man spoke, introducing himself with a name I had never heard before and saying he was just a friend, someone Emily had met recently, someone she had invited over to talk because she had been feeling lonely during the long evenings when I was still at work. And as he spoke the words sounded rehearsed, like a story they had already prepared in case this exact moment ever happened. But the problem with lies is that they rarely survive the weight of reality, and as I listened to him speak, my eyes drifted back toward the bed, noticing details that neither of them seemed to realize were still visible: the way the blankets were slightly twisted, the way Emily's hair was messier than it had been that morning, the way the air in the room carried the unmistakable tension of two people who had been far closer than they should have been. When the man finished speaking, the silence returned again, heavier than before, and I could see the fear growing in his expression as he realized his explanation had not changed anything, and Emily was crying openly now, her shoulders trembling as she whispered that she never meant for me to find out this way. And that sentence was the moment everything inside me finally shattered, because it meant there was something to find out, something she had been hiding, something that existed long before I walked through the door that evening. I looked at both of them standing there in the fading light of the bedroom, realizing that the life I thought I had been living only a few hours earlier no longer existed, and the worst part was that I still did not know how deep the betrayal really went or how long it had been happening behind my back. But I was about to find out. Because the truth was finally beginning to come out, and once the truth begins to surface, it cannot be stopped, no matter how painful it might be for everyone involved. And what Emily said next would change everything forever. The room felt smaller with every second that passed, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the three of us, and the silence that followed Emily's words carried a weight so heavy that it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, because when someone you love admits there was something to find out, it means the truth has been living quietly in the shadows for far longer than you ever imagined. And in that moment I realized that whatever came next would decide the future of everything I once believed about my marriage, my trust, and the woman standing in front of me with tears running down her face. Emily looked at the man beside her one more time before turning back toward me, and there was something different in her expression now, something resigned, almost as if she understood that the lies had reached their limit and that the truth was about to spill out, no matter how painful it might be. And when she finally began to speak, her voice trembled, but the words came out slowly and clearly, like someone stepping into a storm they can no longer avoid. She said his name was Daniel, and that she had met him almost a year ago at a small cafe near the park where she often went in the afternoons when the house felt too quiet, and at first he had been nothing more than a stranger sitting at the same table reading a book and drinking coffee, but over time their casual greetings had turned into conversations, and those conversations had slowly grown longer, deeper, more personal, until one day they were no longer strangers at all. As she spoke, I felt the pieces of the story falling into place in the most painful way possible, because I could remember the times she had mentioned going to that cafe, saying she needed fresh air or a change of scenery during the day, and never once had I imagined that those simple outings were becoming the foundation of something that would eventually destroy the life we had built together. Emily continued, explaining that at first their friendship had felt harmless because she had been lonely during the long hours when I was at work, and Daniel had been someone who listened, someone who understood the quiet frustrations and doubts she had been carrying inside without ever telling me, and slowly those conversations had crossed lines neither of them intended to cross, until feelings began to grow where they never should have existed. The more she talked, the more I felt the strange mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief swirling inside me like a storm that refused to settle, because part of me wanted to shout at her to stop talking, to deny everything, to tell me this was all a misunderstanding, but another part of me knew that once the truth begins to come out, it is better to hear all of it, no matter how much it hurts. Daniel stood quietly near the window, his eyes lowered as if he understood he had no right to defend himself in this moment, and the tension in the room was thick enough to feel in every breath we took, because this was no longer just a moment of being caught, this was the unraveling of a year's worth of hidden emotions, secret meetings, and choices that had slowly pulled Emily away from the life we once shared. She admitted that the relationship had started as emotional conversations long before it became anything physical, and that for months she had convinced herself it was not really cheating because nothing had happened beyond words and feelings, but the truth was those feelings had already changed everything even before the first time they crossed the final line that should never have been crossed. Hearing that it had been going on for almost a year felt like the ground disappearing beneath my feet, because the betrayal was no longer just a single moment I had walked in on, it was months of lies, months of pretending, months of looking into my eyes and telling me everything was fine while another part of her life was unfolding somewhere else. I asked her one question, then the only question that truly mattered in that moment. I asked her if she loved him. The silence that followed was longer than anything we had experienced that night, because sometimes the most painful answers are the ones that take the longest to speak, and Emily closed her eyes briefly before finally whispering something that felt like the final crack in the foundation of everything we had once built together. She said she did not know. Those 3 words carried more devastation than any confession could have, because love is supposed to be certain, especially in a marriage, and hearing that she could not even answer that question meant the distance between us had grown far beyond anything I had realized. For a long moment none of us moved, and then Daniel quietly stepped forward saying that none of this had been planned, that he never intended to destroy a marriage, and that if leaving would make things easier he would go immediately because he understood that this was a moment meant for Emily and me to face alone. I looked at him, then really looked at the man who had slowly become part of my wife's life without me knowing, and I realized something surprising in that moment. My anger toward him was nothing compared to the emptiness I felt toward the woman I loved, because betrayal hurts most when it comes from the person who promised to never be the one who causes that pain. Without raising my voice I told him to leave. He hesitated for a moment, glancing at Emily before walking past me toward the door, and a few seconds later I heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing, leaving the house wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than before, because now it was just the two of us standing in the ruins of what our life used to be. Emily sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, covering her face with her hands as quiet sobs shook her shoulders, and for the first time since walking into that room I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened, the realization that the person I trusted most in the world had been living a completely different story behind my back. I walked to the window, staring out into the darkening street where the last light of the evening had almost disappeared, and I thought about the version of myself who had driven home earlier that day, excited to surprise his wife with dinner, completely unaware that his entire life was about to change forever. After a long time Emily spoke again, asking if there was any chance we could fix what had been broken, if there was any way to rebuild the trust that had collapsed in a single evening. But the truth is, some moments in life create fractures so deep that no amount of apologies can return things to what they once were. I turned toward her slowly, realizing that the hardest part of betrayal is not the anger or the pain, but the understanding that the person you loved no longer exists in the way you believed they did. And in that moment I finally made the decision that would shape the rest of my life. I told her that I could forgive many things in this world, but I could not live the rest of my life wondering if the person beside me was truly mine, or if another secret was waiting somewhere in the shadows. The tears in her eyes grew heavier as she realized what I was saying, but she did not argue, because deep down she understood the same truth I did: some doors once opened can never be closed again. That night I packed a small bag and left the house we once shared, stepping into the quiet darkness outside with the strange feeling that even though my heart was broken, a part of me was finally seeing reality clearly for the first time. And as I drove away from the place that had once been my home, I understood something I will carry with me forever. Sometimes the most unforgettable moment in your life is not the moment you discover the betrayal. It is the moment you finally choose to walk away from it and begin again.